This is Long Live the Queen, a Wisteria podcast. I'm your host, Dorian LeBlanc. Most reviewers credit the game Equinox with revolutionizing the way storytelling works in machine-mediated games. Today's guest is one of the major contributors to that game. He's also author of the cult favorite Cloven and, these days, is one of Wisteria's lead narrative gameplay designers. We're delighted to be sitting down with none other than Randy Silva. Rudy, thank you for being here.
Hey, Dorian. Hey, thanks. What an intro. I'm very flattered. And it's great to be here. I've been listening to the podcast. I love what you guys are doing. I'm excited.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Now, for our listeners, first things first, Rudy is, of course, under current contract with the Wisteria Corporation as a senior designer, which means he's bound by a dynamic non-disclosure agreement. Rudy, that can make it difficult for me to determine what questions are likely to be off limits for you. So how about if I just barrel forward with questions that I think are likely to be within the lines, and I trust that if I cross a line, you'll just let me know and we'll move on to another topic. Will that work?
Yeah, definitely, of course. You know, I like to answer whatever questions I can, and you might not even know that I steered around some hard ones, so don't worry about that.
Perfect. Okay, great, thanks. Now, officially, the narrative design team creates and curates the stories that'll be told in a season of Wisteria. But of course, part of your particular expertise involves encouraging users into those prepared experiences and stories. So this is a topic that confuses a lot of Wisteria enthusiasts who don't immediately grok how it's not 100% free will.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure we'll get into this more in a bit, but for the moment, can you just help us understand a bit more about how this all works? Are you telling a story or giving people a world to play in? Maybe a little bit of both. How does the agency of the players interact with your desire and mission of building a story? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It's one I get all the time because that's basically what me and my team do. It's like our primary job. And, you know, we're not the only team. There's plenty of Wisteria teams who, you know, several of them who do the same exact thing. You know, it's a big organization, a big effort project, obviously. But yeah, I mean, it's all those things. It's an experience. It's a story. People come for lots of different reasons. Some people just want to like live a normal, you know, day-to-day life in this alternate reality that we provide. And some folks are there for exciting moments and dramatic stories. And of course, we have a whole audience outside the experience who likes to look for those stories and like craft them together into narratives and so on. So our job is really just to make sure all that's available to people. And I mean, really, one of the things that we get most excited about on our teams is luring people into this, you know, these story content, these situations that have been created. Because, you know, we do obviously have a sense of what's going to be possible this season. What are the dramatic moments we want to guide people into? And a lot of what our team does is just make it feel very natural that, you know, our players found those experiences. Like we kind of provide these like what we call on-ramps into the prepared content and make it feel like it was your decision all along to participate.
Yeah, one thing I'm a little bit nervous about in this interview is in sort of pulling back the curtain on some of what it is that you do. I'm a little bit concerned that, you know, we're going to take away some of the magic for players, even though, you know, I know in my heart that everyone who's experienced Wisteria, either as a player or even as an observer, knows that there has to be a ton of expertise and effort that goes into creating these smooth experiences, that nothing that looks that magical can possibly be anything other than, you know, a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes.
Well, sure. You know, and every media throughout history has had this necessity for our audience to, you know, what we call suspend disbelief and believe they're participating in a real situation. Like when you read a book or watch a movie, you know, part of your mind knows like, well, this is just an actor. You know, this guy's not really he's not in real danger of dying. He's an actor on a set. But you willfully decide not to believe that. And so Wisteria has a very evolved, like, kind of mechanism for that, you know, of asking our audience to suspend their disbelief. But it's still, I think, in a lot of ways, the same thing. So, yeah, you know, some of the illusion you'll see behind the scenes a little bit, and that might weaken the illusion for you. But I still think we're providing, you know, you can still get in there and enjoy the experience. And geez, you know, nothing against movies and books. I mean, that's the type of media I consume the most probably. But at the same time, Wisteria's you know, sense of reality is just so strong, so pervasive. It's really on a different level. So the illusion's strong.
Yeah, for sure. Let me ask you about the role of structure in the creative process. I mean, this is a thing that's been bandied about for a while. I wonder, have you found that your relationship to structure with respect to creativity needed to shift or evolve in some way when you got involved directly with Wisteria, or does it work the same way that it might work with with creating a novel, with creating a movie, that sort of thing? Or are there some?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I cited novels and movies, but as you mentioned, my background's really in more interactive and dynamic media, and for sure, there's a difference in how you approach the creation between a linear media where the audience doesn't get to drive any part of it versus one where the audience's decisions and actions and expressions change, which is actually going on in the media. And yeah, there's a different design approach. You know, a linear media is really just about creating this like tense line of events that must have taken place the way we depict them in a linear media because of the characters, because of the situations they're put in, like this, like a crucible of stress, you know, as we've often called it, crucible of like what the characters' values are and what's happening in the world, that kind of thing. And you don't need that as much in interactive media. I mean, it's great when you can achieve it, and that's something we strive for, but you already have that sense of immediacy because it's you making those decisions. You know, you don't have to like observe from a distance and have that crucible be the thing that draws you in. Instead, you're the one making those decisions. So yeah, I'm making it sound like it's easier. It's actually harder in a lot of ways because there's so many more places. And, you know, a linear story, you just have to tell this one story that works perfectly, and it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but with Wisteria or the other interactive media, we just have to create all this content, all this space, and any path through that has to be a good piece of content. So sure, the user already feels engaged. We get that for free, quote unquote. But yeah, we just have to do so much more work to make sure every path in there is a good story.
Well, and you're doing it in real time. I mean, there's an infinite number of choices that a very large number of players can be making. Can you help us understand a little bit about what happens when users make choices that you didn't expect when you were writing the story, or is that something that just doesn't come up? How does that piece all work?
Oh, it comes up. I mean, it doesn't come up as, I mean, some way you're asking, like, what is the entirety of your job? You know, because our job is to try to.
Sure.
I don't want to say prevent that. It's more like to predict it and accommodate it. You know, it's to like think through what each character in the game is going, you know, each player is going to maybe do, and then think about how we can guide them back into an experience which has been created. But as you point out, like, that it's an imperfect science, it's an imperfect art, and there's always characters who wind up in different places. And yeah, there's a ton of best practice that goes on there. I mean, I'm sure it's no secret that during, you know, a Wisteria game, it's not like an old video game where you just like create the content and walk off and be like, hope that worked out. Like, we're right there live watching, you know, the teams are working around the clock, watching the content unfolds. And you know, we have great tools. We've got the Parliament AI working for us and so forth. And it's a lot of our job is just to adapt on the fly to what the user's doing. And most of the time it works really well. I mean, it's a good system, and we can create content out in the direction that the users are moving. Like we have kind of like an improv comedy yes and mentality. Like, oh, if the user really wants to go out here, like let's see what's out there. Let's help them do that. But always with this ideal of guiding them back in, just because we feel like the prepared experience is the heart of what draws people back to Wisteria. But some people will go and continue pursuing that. Part of the reason it's rare is because it's not just, you know, one user making that decision. We have a whole, you know, host of occupants in each character and it's rare that they aggregate to a decision that is something like that.
Sure, that makes sense. And of course, you know, even if you're playing one of the less expensive characters, right? It's a significant commitment for most people to, you know, participate in Wisteria for a weekend and that sort of thing. And so I can imagine that the number of users who get in there for the purpose of just kind of being yahoos and breaking the system is probably pretty small, and that's pretty manageable. But I wonder, do you have any stories of, you know, surprising or upsetting experiences that you've had as a part of this work, or does that really not enter into it for some of the reasons that I've mentioned?
Oh, geez. No, I mean, you know, I guess I'm making it sound like it's all easy and predictable. But no, I feel like the surprises are the norm. I feel like, if anything, in some level, it's always a surprise when we manage to make everything look so smooth and seamless. That's a big success. And, I feel like we pull it off by the skin of our teeth a lot of the time. What's a cool surprise? I mean, I'm always interested and surprised by the fact that, you know, people come in with a certain mentality about what experience they want to get from Wisteria, like their, you know, what I call their core or their native personality in the real world. And then I'm always surprised to see like how that changes when they're actually occupying one of our characters. And, you know, sometimes the surprise is that these people who were drawn to the dramatic storytelling, like the risk-taking personalities, to see that they wind up just kind of like living a normal life. And we just really have to prod to try to get them onto the adventure paths that we've created, right? And then the opposite is sometimes true, where, you know, and this one really tickles me, where in the intake forms, people will say like, no, I'm just here. I want to be a librarian. I want to be a farmer. I don't need to be involved. I just want to have the day-to-day life of this alternate world. And sometimes those are the easiest characters to just draw into adventures and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think those things are surprising, but they come up all the time, and they're just interesting to observe. You also said upsetting. I mean, not so much. I mean, the rogue NPCs freak me out. I'm sure you guys have heard about those. It's like we occasionally have characters who were never occupied by humans, that were just, you know, computer-driven characters, who just sort of disappear and or go off the rails, and we have a hard time tracking them down. Some of them are still wandering around, you know, like ghost in the system style.
Yep, that makes sense. Well, and you know, it speaks to the fact that, you know, you have so many characters, many of whom are players and many of whom are not, all interacting. You know, the graph of all the interactions is just, you know, it's beyond what even modern AI can handle, or at least so I would assume. So I've got to imagine that no matter how many designers you have working for you, there's still, you know, there's triage from moment to moment.
Oh, geez, yeah. And, you know, and there's so much coordination required. We have so many different ways to sort of like, it's kind of like air traffic control, ways to like hand off story intentions from one team to another and be like, okay, well, you know, this is going to connect over here, so try to drive towards that. Because, you know, as much as we prepare in advance for every season, there's just so many of us and so many threads going on at a time, it's hard to keep track of all of them. But, I mean, the AI tools are amazing for that. They really do help sort that out and keep us on track.
Yeah, I want to get a little bit into Lethicynth and some of the implications of the use of that. But before we get too far into that, let me just ask, sort of in a higher level sense, since players don't bring their own personal history with them into the game, right? They're playing another character. You've already alluded to the idea that you know, a particular personality, even if dropped into a character that's markedly different from their own personality, is going to still tend to follow the curves, if I can read between those lines, follow the curves of their own experience, even if they don't have direct access to it. What's your sense of, if I go into Wisteria, am I playing sort of a hybrid combination of my own identity and the character's identity? Is the goal for me to fully inhabit that character and have those experiences? Like, how do you as a designer think about the interaction between the player's core person, for lack of a better word, and the identity, the character that they're dropping into?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I love this question. It really brings, you know, some of the things I think are the most exciting about Wisteria. I mean, I think a lot of players come to Wisteria sort of to like test who they really are on some level, you know. So what you're asking is like, well, how do we know what someone really is? Because of course, once you're in Wisteria, you don't have access to the memories of your regular day-to-day life. You know, you think of yourself as being, first of all, alone in this character, as we all do in real life as well. Hopefully, most of us consider ourselves to be the only occupant of our own body and mind. You know, you think of yourself also just as that character inherently, not as somebody who's playing a video game occupying that character. And so, you know, the question is, what part of your real core personality is still left over, and how is that personality contributing to? And we see this a little better when there's few occupants, and, you know, a character that's sort of not one of the high-ranking characters, who doesn't get a whole lot of occupants. You can actually see a little better how the inherent personality of the players modify the behaviors of that character. So yeah, I think it's a cool personality test, and I love it as a question. You know, so your question was like, how do we make decisions about that? I mean, I think we're in the same place that everybody else is. Like, we have more access to it, but we're just observing this interesting phenomenon. You know, if people like, what happens when you take, it's not even like a brain transfer. It's just like the personality of someone and put them in a different memory compartment of the brain. And how does the brain and, you know, how does your personality and your memory sort of work together to produce your desired behaviors? We notice the difference, we think about it. But a lot of it we leave up to the players. Players get to decide which characters they want to occupy, you know?
Yeah, fair enough. I was going to leave questions from the feed to later in the segment, but Seeker 2017 wrote in with something that I think might be relevant here. He or she writes, games could be considered a kind of training for removing external factors, i.e., they're a way to learn to be grounded. I'm not sure what that means, but let me go on. What happens when you use them instead as a set of replacement external factors, e.g., does lethacinth prime the act of radical forgiveness? I'm sorry if that's a little bit off topic, but that seemed like it might relate to some of the things that you're talking about. Does that resonate in any way for you?
Well, that sounds a little bit more cerebral than I usually, the level I think. If I understood correctly, it was like
those are our listeners for you.
Yeah, for sure. And we love that. That's just great that Wisteria can bring these kind of questions to the forefront. I'm not the most philosophical person at the company. So I'm sure other people would jump on this and have better responses. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a different experience in video games. I think video games have this detachment where you know that you are participating in a simulated experience. You can be both yourself and the character in the game at the same time. And in Wisteria, you don't have that remove. You aren't aware that you're, and so it certainly is going to bring out deeper personality characteristics. And I'm sure it has some pretty interesting psychological effects.
Yeah, and the fact that it's deeper just means that the experience is more meaningful for the people who participate, and the connections that they form and so on are just more meaningful in general, which I think is, a big part of what's made Wisteria such a force, honestly, in storytelling and in gaming.
For sure, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. So. Let me ask this one. I've been hesitating here, but I would like to dive into this. Part of your professional reputation, Rudy, is in opposition to violence, which is a stance that sometimes put you in the minority of your past teams, as has been reported. Mm-hmm. Now, the Wisteria technology, as we've alluded to, relies in part on a drug popularly called lethacinth, which, of course, is responsible for suppressing the real memories of players while they're in game. And of course, this is a carefully monitored technology. Players have to be in what we might call a hospitalized environment in order to play. Lethacinth was originally developed, as many know, as a PTSD treatment. But of course, it's not only a Schedule I dissociative that's sometimes abused in the real world, but its very function does detectably change the structure of the brain, albeit only at a very subtle level. Maybe most importantly, though, the use of lethacinth in some sense short-circuits some of your responsibilities, in that you can act badly and then forget having done whatever it was that you did. And now, I know that Wisteria has some safeguards in place, of course, but for some of these reasons, maybe without context, there are groups that consider lethacinth itself as inherently violent. So, Rudy, let me ask you, what do you consider violence? Does Wisteria's use of lethacinth qualify? And maybe, what would you say in response to some of these groups who may have some of these views, perhaps in a less informed way?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I mean, for starters, you asked about my reputation or relationship with violence in media, and I think this is a little bit overstated. Like, I believe that violence does have a place in storytelling and in media. I mean, the media I enjoy has violent moments in it. My take is I just want to be cautious with the kind of violence that winds up in Wisteria. And I think we are, I think I've been very pleased with how we approach this. So one of the razors we talk about is like, well, you can be a detective in a Jack the Ripper story, but you can't be the serial killer, So there's a way that you can participate in something violent, but we don't let you indulge in a deep way into, or we have safeguards to keeping from that kind of thing from happening, even if an entire user base and occupant in a PC wanted it to happen. And I think that's the right line to walk, So for various reasons, I guess we don't need to get too deeply into the philosophy of violence in media, but and for lethacinth, I mean, I would say no. It's I have to differentiate the violence in the real world with other types of violence, right? Like when people in the real world actually harm each other, that's clearly violence. There's clearly something wrong going on. But people who play Wisteria are consenting adults, and they're informed about the decisions as they go in. And as you say, like, lethacinth is already out there in the world, and people who are going to abuse it whether or not Wisteria exists. And it's not. I mean, I can imagine a scenario where it's like, well, hey, you took this experimental drug and then you had this really terrible experience, and hey, you knew you were doing that. That would still potentially be considered violence, but I don't think that's how it goes for the vast majority, if not the entirety of Wisteria players. You do still get to understand your experience, like what your experience was like after you leave. So it's not like it's a race in your mind and you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe I was murdering people in there. I don't know. I guess in short, for me, Wisteria is a test bed for your personality, and it just doesn't have long-term real-world consequences the way that the real-life violence does. I see them as very different.
Yeah,
And
that makes
I'm not
sense.
trying to be apologist about our use of Let's Synth, but again, it's like these are people who go into this experience because it's what they want.
I think there's something to be said for the idea of the technology exists, right? And as you say, right, it's not as though Wisteria is the only place that you can get this substance or maybe get some aspects of this experience. And so the question isn't is it right or wrong? The question is, how are we going to handle the fact that we've now unlocked this what some would call a Pandora's box.
Yeah. Pandora's boxes have all kinds of connotations. I mean, it's also like, it's a little bit of a modern miracle that it enables you to participate in this experience this way. There's nothing, it's part of why there's never been anything like Wisteria before.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. Well, backing away from, some of the more pointed accusations, let me just ask if is there a moral gray area around having people surrender their identity in order to gain agency in the game world? And I should point out, right, this question is written in a very pointed way. My producers and I sort of debated the wording of this, and what it really comes down to is that, on one hand, we love so much of what Wisteria represents, but at the same time, we have this constant stream of feedback from detractors, the Luddites, the meatheads, whatever you want to call them, who routinely, try to contribute to the show in this way. And so, since we've got you here, we would like to provide an opportunity to speak to some of these issues where, as I say, some would frame as a moral quandary. Others would just consider, the price of admission for, as you say, a modern miracle. Do you have any thoughts around that? Again, the morality of surrendering your identity in exchange for identity in this magical world.
Yeah, I'm always a little confused by this point of view, because it's like, well, we aren't. It's not like taxes, it's not like you have to do it. Like you don't have to participate in Wisteria experiences. If you don't like that, you don't have to participate. And not only that, but therefore everybody who is choosing to participate likes the idea of that. We don't hear a lot of feedback at Wisteria for people who are like, oh, I would really love to play Wisteria, but only if I can both be aware of my real world self and immersed in this environment at the same time. And the reason we don't hear that, I think, is because there's plenty of experiences that offer that, And to me, in my mind, they're slightly lesser experiences. They don't involve the real, we've been talking about this illusion between media and reality. They don't dissolve that illusion nearly as well. So I think people are here because it's what they want. And unlike, that's a weak argument that's been applied elsewhere in history. It's, we're not like drug dealers who are like, well, people are buying the crack because they want it. Too bad they should know that it's going to destroy their lungs or whatever. It doesn't destroy your lungs. Yeah. Wisteria is, and I think a lot of ways Wisteria is good for people. It really lets them, examine their psyches, and it's, it is, an outlet. It is, some relief from the omnipotent presence of the real world. There's a lot of things it's doing that I think are good for folks.
Yeah, and I think the argument could be made pretty compellingly that even if you're not a player within Wisteria, even if you're just consuming the feed right in your local hangout, you still get some real benefits along those same lines, because of course part of what makes Wisteria worth consuming on the feed, even not as a participant, is that the characters are relatable, right? In part because they're real people, and in part because you've put a lot of effort along with your team into making the situations feel believable and feel related to the real world challenges people have, even though they are taking place in a completely different environment. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I just don't see where the moral quandary comes from.
Yeah.
It seems like a little out of left field.
What I can say is, given some of the communications we've received as just a podcast about Wisteria, I can only imagine what your PR department has to put up with on its end. Yeah, for sure.
It's a big phenomenon, so of course it's going to attract all kinds of points of view, and that's just something we have. It's just a reality we live in.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. We've got a lot of other questions from the feed. I want to see how many of these we can come to. Catbus1981 writes in, what's the wildest thing you've seen a rogue NPC do? Well, we might be getting into that NDA at this point, but what stories, if any, do you have?
I don't think I can talk about that too much, as you say, but some of it would not be as shocking to the audience, right? It's a little bit more shocking to us developers. It's just like the way they seem to I mean, okay. So if you're in the audience, you already think like, well, these AIs already have control over their autonomy and they make their own decisions. Well, yes and no, right? Like there is a lot of these are the NPC characters, the ones who are never occupied by any players. They do have a lot of autonomy, but it's well under our control, and there's a lot in normal circumstances. So the thing with the rogue AIs is when they're sometimes making very sophisticated, very human-seeming decisions. That's actually what freaks me out the most. I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff they do, which is a little bit more like spurious bugs that shouldn't happen in reality. You will see them occasionally switch languages in the middle of sentences, and they're not supposed to be languages they can speak. You will see them physically teleport from one place of the mainland to another. That one really bothers me because I don't like it when it breaks the illusion. At least with them.
Yeah, hopefully off camera. Yeah.
Oh, geez, yeah. And some of that is just they're buggy. Not usually, of course. They're super good most of the time, but once in a while we have some bugs. And if they're just switching languages, we just try to find a story beat to cover it up. Make it into a story, right? Yeah. When they teleport, that's a lot harder to manage.
That makes sense. It's funny you should mention that because I'm aware, even as a viewer, that there have been some behaviors of certain characters that have led me to think, oh, well, that must have been just a player was just kind of being cranky. And now that you're talking this through, I'm realizing maybe I just saw some NPC doing something wacky, but of course we're very quick to assume the best and to assume, oh, that's just a player sort of, getting outside the lines.
But your intuition is right. Like well over 90% of the time, if it seems like a wacky behavior, it's either like a deep story cut that we put in there, or it's a player controlled character.
Yeah. This leads really well into a question that Sage Quit wrote in with. Sage writes, it seems we make story connections out of everyday things, even when those things are totally disconnected, like conspiracy theories. With such a complex setting, have players ever created story threads in Wisteria that you didn't intend, but had to address because it became so popular?
The place where this seems the most obvious is when the audience does it, of the Wisteria 3 threads and so forth. Like, I mean, there was a season recently where there is a cave that a couple of our player characters kept sort of passing by, and so they would it would just, it was kind of like someone had hung a lamp on it. Like a lantern on it. Like the audience, because of the way the scene was cut, the audience kept thinking, oh, there's something in this cave, because some of our key characters went past it a few times. We didn't have a whole lot planned for the cave. It was a very stubbed out experience. And then there was at the same time, there was like a witch character who was in a village, actually not even that close by, but it was another sort of like dangling thread. And I just remember there were so many different theories about how the cave and the witch were connected. And we hadn't intended for them to be connected, but as a lot of the audience will know, without wanting to get any spoilers, we did sort of weave that into this story because it just felt like the audience wanted it. For the players, I mean, the players are in the world. It's always a trick for me to talk about the players as being audience members. They're audience members when they leave Wisteria, but not when they're in it. So do they see connections? Yeah, but they're participating in a real world, and they have their hypotheses about what they should be doing, and they test them out, and the world responds. That's just normal gameplay to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hawk Handsaw 54424 wrote in with a question. This kind of brings us back to earlier in our discussion, but maybe there's an interesting twist in here. They write, most other virtual experiences sell the idea of you can do anything you want, but with the rather Las Vegas-ish implication that amorality, if not immorality, is the selling point, but not Wisteria, right? Do you modify people's emotional states so that they act less atrociously? And if not, how does it not descend into murder fests like Blood Kings or Law of the West or similar games?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is another case where I think Wisteria handles things really well, and also I give a lot of credit to our players and our community. I think players essentially self-select for which experiences they're going to get into. Like for Blood Kings and Law of the West, the players who are going there are looking for that kind of experience, and so it's going to lend to them participating that way. And not only that, but of course they retain their intentions and their memories when they're in those experiences. So they just have much more control to participate that way. And in Wisteria, they don't. They even if you wanted to be like this big blood murderer or something, first of all, you're contending with whoever else is occupying your PC. And second of all, you might not just remember that, again, what is your intention when you came in to play Wisteria? It doesn't always connect when you're actually in the game. And and basically, I mean, I believe that human nature is generally good. I mean, that's what I've observed from watching so many people like have their memories wiped and take a step into this world, which actually has a lot of potential for violence. They don't behave that way. I mean, there's certainly occasionally erratic people, but it would take a lot of psycho killers all occupying one character for that character to behave like a psycho killer. So no, do we suppress people's instincts? Nope, we don't. We don't have to.
Yeah, and again, it just comes down to network effects, as we've seen as early as the beginning of the century. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Because I mean, it's the thing is like when you play a different experience, it's like, well, this isn't a real, in Law of the West, this isn't a real Western village. These aren't real people. I'm not going to be here tomorrow. I don't have to contend with the consequences. That just gives you a lot more freedom. A lot of what we see in Wisteria really is like sort of, as you just alluded to, like it's sort of the social pressures of the environment, like don't exist in other types of experiences, but they do in Wisteria. Like you actually are living in there. You have lived there your whole life, and you're going to be still living there tomorrow. You don't want to cause trouble.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And that gets back to a point you made earlier where sometimes you actually have to push people into doing the adventurous thing because,
And so much of our job, is just finding the right on-ramps that get people out of their sedentary life, their comfortable day-to-day routine, and getting them off into an adventure. That's the whole art form that we do.
How funny that it's the experience they're paying for, and yet it requires expertise and judgment to nudge them into it because of the nature of the
environment. And that's why there's not just my department, but multiple departments who just make this work. Because the last thing we want is for people to come away from Wisteria feeling like they just didn't get what they went in there for. So and it's a lot of what we do is just try to like dangle that opportunity in front of them just the right way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Parappa Smurf writes in with a bit of an off-the-wall question. I love the early season's focus on the Thieves' Trust in Langdon. Will we ever see Basso again?
Basso. Well, okay. I mean, I also love that experience. And you remember I haven't been at Wisteria since the very beginning. So I did come along and helped out with the execution of some of that part. But it was really, there was sort of the foundational genius storytellers and designers who created those ideas that I helped with. But that said, I mean, our team is one of the many teams that participate in the story on a higher level. Because, we've talked about our team as sort of this onboarding team that tries to get our players into the experience after they've occupied their player. There's plenty of teams who do other things that are pertain to the story. And all of us together sort of collaborate on story ideas, story concepts, and content. And Basso's name comes up a lot because he's a fan favorite. And I guess one thing I would offer, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but people in this upcoming season it's not a direct allusion to Basso, but people will pick up on it, and there might be some hints there about what you can expect in the future.
That's great. Yeah, something to look out for. This one, I get such a kick out of this. I hope you'll take this with a grain of salt as I have. Metem Psycho Sis writes in, have you ever thought who's writing your story, Mr. Big Game Designer? Or do you imagine you're the topmost turtle asking for a friend?
Oh, geez. Yeah, I'm a topmost turtle guy. Yeah, I think that, the reality that you and I are speaking in right now, that's the real one. And I don't think we're being controlled by other characters. I mean, Wisteria is, again, it's a modern miracle of fidelity of experience being represented virtually. Like it's so amazing. And when you're in it, you don't notice the little details, the little artifacts that, and most of the time in our feeds, people cut away from them. That's not the thing they put in the foreground. But if you were a conscious human participating in Wisteria, you would see them. It's not a perfect simulation. It's not perfect. So to me, that gives us evidence that it's not like when I'm in the real world, I notice these artifacts. I don't see the glitch in the matrix. And so this isn't something I question a whole lot in the first place, but I feel pretty comfortable saying we live in reality and Wisteria is not reality.
Yeah, for sure. But one of the questions that I did want to get into a little bit with you is the idea of the future of these experiences, right? Can games replace real life? And so far what you've said is, the technology's not there in effect. Do you think that that's the only thing stopping games from becoming real life, at least for some players? Or do you feel like it's not a technological divide? There's a difference there that we can never breach.
Yeah, it's closer to the latter. I mean, I don't stray too deeply into the realms of philosophy, but one of the few places I do is to say that I just, I work with, if not some of, then probably the most sophisticated AI tools and collaborators that the world has ever seen, right? They're amazing.
Yeah.
But I can still tell the difference between what's created by an AI and what's not, I just think it's, AIs are amazing tools, but they're tools, and they're never going to be able to participate in reality in a way that a human being can. And human beings do create reality in reality, but we don't create simulated realities. And I think it would require a human being capable of creating a simulating reality for that divide to melt away. I mean, it can get asymptotically close. It's just never going to cross over. It's just a different thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Rudy, I got to tell you that I've been covering this game or this experience, I should say, for quite a long time. But I feel like I can now look at Wisteria with a little more informed eyes and with more appreciative eyes. I feel like just getting this glimpse into how it looks from your end has been wonderful for me, as I'm sure it has been for our listeners. On behalf of all the listeners here at Long Live the Queen, thank you for all the work you're doing to make Wisteria a part of our lives. And to all the listeners, of course, be sure to run out and buy Equinox and Cloven and continue to participate in the wonderful world that our guest Randy Silva has helped bring to us. Rudy, thank you so much for being a guest here on Long Live the Queen.
Well, gosh, thank you guys so much. I mean, it's a privilege to be able to work on Wisteria and to make these stories that you guys participate in. It's been a privilege to be on this podcast as well. So thank you so much, Dorian. Appreciate you having me.
No, thank you again.